Chapter 25, Kiiwen. After that, we did what we did best. We ran. A few of the main campers took the vehicles and went ahead with the 2 school prisoners and the body of Minerva. We all met up in 2 days' time, the ones who drove, the main campers who stayed behind to pack up, and the remainder of the failed rescue crew. We left the prisoners by the side of the road a days in. They had a tin of soup each and a blanket to share, so they'd be fine until rescue, we hoped. We'd bury Minerva the next day, the council holding ceremony and prayer, even in the midst of our escape. Before I could stop her, Rose took scissors to her curls. When she was done, her lighter hair bounced into ringlets around her face. She didn't cry. She didn't even seem to notice. She was far away with her grief. I picked up the scissors when she put them down and cut off my own braid to send with Minerva. Afterwards, Rose, retreating a bit from her reverie, evened out my hair for me so that it hung about an inch below my ears. I hadn't felt so vulnerable since the day Meg had found me, half dead, sick from spoiled supplements, hallucinating. She kissed me when she was finished, tossing the rough edges of my cut hair into the fire. Our fight back in the valley had dissolved in the thick brew of tragedy, no more than a seasoning that we might pull out later on. We were broken, an almost unrecognizable bunch of mourners, held together by habit and grief and a shared history of survival. But we still had our Mig, our leader and elder, all rolled into one now. And we had the new campers and the council, so we managed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. No one said, "What now?" No one even mentioned we'd lost the key to taking down the schools, and if they had, we'd have crumpled where we stood, no longer able to move. We traveled for 10 days before we were ensconced in Precambrian rock and vicious pine. Then the group moved as one machine, setting up the main camp, stringing the woods with traps and alarms. And by the end of day 2, it was as if we'd been there all along. There was even a gray muslin flag hung at half-mast by the bent bow archway into our spot. My dad surveyed the work, leaning on me for support. Well, it's not as nice as the last place, but it'll do. Summer came on quick and merciless in the next 2 weeks. Wob and Chiboy were officially shacked up now. Clarence taught them how to put up a teepee, and that's where they slept. When the heat brought with it summer clothing, it became apparent to all of us that Wob was expecting a baby. The whole camp rejoiced and kept her well fed and cared for. Rose tried to be happy, but mostly she was quiet. The council spent a lot of time piecing together the few words and images each of us carried. Hello and goodbye in Cree, a story about a girl named Sedna whose fingers made all the animals in the north. They wrote down what they could, drew pictures, and made the camp recite what was known for sure. It was Bullet's idea to start a youth council, to start passing on the teachings right away, while they were still relearning themselves. Slopper was tasked with putting that together, and he thrived under the responsibility. He even gave them a name, Miigwanags, feathers. We were desperate to craft more keys, to give shape to the kind of Indians who could not be robbed. It was hard, desperate work. We had to be careful we weren't making things up, half remembered, half dreamed. We felt inadequate. We felt hollow in the places, and at certain hours, we didn't even have names for it in our languages. The day Rose left, I had learned how to write family in syllabics, using ash on a creamy curl of birch bark. I was sitting with the council during syllabics lesson when she walked by, slow and deliberate, sadness in her gait. She didn't say anything, but I saw the peak of her tent collapse from the cluster where it had stood, like a circus pulling up for the next town. I guess I knew it right then. I just didn't want to acknowledge it. When she appeared in the clearing, all packed up and starting her long, tearful goodbyes, collecting advice and small offerings, I took off and I hid in a tangle of pines about 50 meters from the camp. I didn't want to see or hear her leave. I stayed there until the sun started to descend, hating myself every single minute. But what could I do? I'd found my home, right? And I just couldn't leave my dad. It would kill him. Leaving to go back to church would be insanity. No, it was better that we just stuck together and stayed clear of the schools for now, until we figured out our next move, until we gathered up enough odds and ends to open a door. But sitting there was torture. I kept having second thoughts that pushed needles into my feet, and I stood and I started to run back more than once, only to stop short and talk myself back into the pines. Come on, French, I told myself. You have a good place to live, and you found your dad. There's so much to learn here. What could going back into the woods possibly do? and I played with Mig's pouch around my neck to keep me grounded, pulling on the mud-stained shoelaces, fingering the contents through the hide. I'd loose the ties a little and pushed my finger inside the top, absent-mindedly seeking purchase. There was his tobacco that jabbed under my nail, and then something real solid, and today my hands needed to touch something real. I had to give it back to him. We'd survived the failed ambush, and he should have it back. I pulled it off my neck and worked the cinched top open with both hands. I grabbed for what was nestled in there and worked it out, tapping tobacco crumbs into my palm so as not to lose the precious flakes. It was a glass vial, only half full. I spun it between my fingers and saw the label. 66542G, 41-year-old male, Euro Anishinaabe. This must be the vial he ID'd as Isaac's. I recalled what Mig used to tell me when I'd first come, when I was nosy enough to ask unwelcome questions, and had tried to pry into the contents of that bag. It's where I keep my heart. It's too dangerous to keep it in my chest, what with the sharp edges of bones so easily broken. When I came back into the clearing, I knew for sure that she was gone. Everything felt different, smaller and bigger at the same time. As was becoming my habit when I was confused or hurt, I made my way to my dad's. He was living in a 4-walled tent with a smaller table and a cot, and there was some thin rugs over the dirt floor. He was sitting at a table, flipping through one of the half-dozen books the camp owned. This one was a hardcover by the great woman I had heard quoted at council named Miracle. Jojo had brought it with her from the west, where revolution was sparking along the ragged coast. He didn't seem surprised to see me, and he kicked out the chair opposite him for me to sit down, and I sank into it, and almost on cue my eyes filled with water. I swiped at them, but eventually they were too quick for me to keep up. My father watched for a minute and then placed the book on the table in front of him. He sighed so big his shoulders slumped where they curved out of his faded undershirt, so thin that I could follow the angles and ridges of his scars like tattoos under fabric. You remember how I told you about me and your mom meeting up in the city, about how happy we were? I nodded, and dislodged tears splashed on the wood in front of me. Well, I could never shake that feeling of helplessness that brought me to that church that day back home. It was always there, like the way the blister reminds you of itself every step. Your mom, she was always way smarter than me. One day, she found me drinking bootleg with a couple of boys in Chinatown. I was supposed to be looking for work that day, but your mom, she doesn't yell. She doesn't even get mad. He paused until I lifted my head and looked at him. He was crying too, already saying goodbye. Your mother, she just looks at me real serious and says, Jean, running only works if you're moving towards something, not away. Otherwise, you'll never get anywhere. I heard this in my mother's voice, as sure as if she had been sitting on the cot beside us, braiding her hair before bed, like she always did when she came to say goodnight to me and Mitch. Dad? Yes, son. I have to go. I know. I rose from the table, adrenaline punching my calves into action, stopping long enough to hug him. And he kissed me on the top of my head, just like he used to when I was little, and I felt safe enough to leave him. I rushed out of the tent at full speed, skidded into my camp, and grabbed all my belongings. I left our tent for Slopper and returned Meg's pouch, hanging it off the center pole of his tent across the fire from ours. There was no time to make goodbyes. I knew they'd understand. Sure, my dad would explain. Besides, I couldn't bring myself to face Meg with the news of my departure, and I'd already lost a few hours, and night was falling fast. I took off running, away from the camp, the council, my family, running towards Rose, who was somewhere beyond the beaded edge of the woods, running towards an idea of home that I wasn't willing to lose, not even if it meant running away from the family that I'd already found. Anine! I almost tripped over my own feet at the sound of her voice. Sure enough, there was Rose, sitting on a log about 20 meters into the bush, her backpack at her feet. Most of her newly shorn curls were piled on the top of her head in a messy bun. A few escaped and sat on her forehead like springs. Jesus, you startled me, she chuckled. Startled? You damn near jumped out of your skin. Yeah, well, what are you even doing here? Her brow furrowed. You know what I mean. You left hours ago. I thought I was in for an evening run. I stood in front of her, not sure if I should sit, not sure if we were continuing on just yet. Yeah, well, she kicked at the dirt between my boots. Maybe I just wanted to give you a break. And what made you so sure I would even follow you? I nudged the toe of her shoe with mine. She didn't look up, but I could see the edges of a smile creep into her cheeks. It made her eyes narrow and her forehead smooth like a pulled sheet. A hunch, I guess. Oh, a hunch, eh? I bent over, pushing my nose into the massive curls on her head. I smelled flowers right before they burst out of their green cocoons. Yeah, she looked up, turning her face up towards mine. A hunch and a lot of hope. I leaned further in, closing my eyes in anticipation of the bright connection of her lips. And then I heard it. She placed a hand on my chest, suspending my descent, alerting me that she'd heard it too. I listened. Runners. Quiet and traveling light. I held up three fingers to indicate the number of bodies I heard pushing through the trees. They were too close for us to get a meaningful head start. We'd have to hide instead. I pointed to the ground. Rose slid off the back of the log, snaking a leg behind her and dragging her backpack as she went. I placed two hands on the mossy wood and leapt over, landing on tiptoes and then sinking down. We half burrowed into the soggy leaves, the smell of decay and rebirth clouding around us, and then we waited. When I heard the first pair of feet stomp by, we kept our heads down. Boots. They were definitely wearing boots and not the mesh runners of the recruiters. When the second tore by, I listened harder. The dull click of a rifle butt hitting a belt. Officers travel with handguns, not rifles. I peeked over the log. I recognized the braid flying out behind the third runner as he rushed by, holding his rifle against his side, bandana up over his nose. I stood and called out, "Derek?" He turned, slowing to a jog. He pointed in the direction that he'd come from. Unknowns, about 5 or 6 of them, half a mile northeast. Northeast? That's the way we were headed. Rose got to her knees beside me. Gonna send out a welcome party. Derek turned and picked up the speed back towards camp. I sighed, counting the available bodies to go out to the welcome party, now that Rose and I were gone. And what if they were hostile? We weren't going to be safe and continue on until we knew what was up. I was trying to find a way to delay Rose when she got to her feet beside me. Well, I guess we can wait till tomorrow. She picked up her pack, slung it over her shoulder, and started off on a slow run after Derek. Are you sure? She shouted back. Can't let them go without us. That would just be irresponsible. I smiled. God, I really like this girl. I jumped over the log and took off after her, eager for the excitement of a welcome party expedition, where you didn't know if you'd find blood relatives, poachers, or strangers. Neither of us could imagine that everything would change in just a few hours, including the idea of keys.